They said he was a savage, a beast who lived alone in the high pines, scarred by war and whispered sins. When the townsmen dragged him into the square, bound and bloodied, ready to kill what they feared, she stepped forward. "Don't hurt him," she said. "I'll buy him." The crowd laughed, but she didn't flinch. Who was this woman? Why would anyone fight for a man like that? And what secret pain did he carry that made her see not a monster, but a man worth saving? Stay with us for a story of judgment, redemption, and the quiet power of love, when fear speaks louder than truth and a single voice dares to stand against the mob. One question lingers. Who really needed saving that day, the outcast or the ones who cast him out? Every time you share your thoughts, I'm reminded that stories like this reach beyond time and place. If you believe in second chances, in quiet bravery, and the kind of compassion that changes lives, then you belong here. Drop a comment with the state you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe so we can keep telling stories that matter. The wind carried grit down the muddy road as Clara stumbled past the last fence post of town. Her dress, once a shade of pale blue, was stained with dust and shame. A crowd had gathered at the edge of the square to watch her go, some with folded arms, others whispering behind gloved hands. No one stepped forward. No one offered her bread or a coat. Sheriff Daly stood beside his horse, his eyes low, his mouth tight. "Town's got no place for troublemakers," he'd muttered before tossing her faded satchel into the dirt. "Especially ones who cry wolf." Clara didn't answer. Her cheek still burned where Mr. Sloane's ring had split the skin the night before. When she'd slapped his hand away in the depot office, he'd snarled and said she'd regret it. And now here she was regretting it, perhaps, but not for the reason he'd meant. She wasn't ashamed of what she'd done. She was ashamed that no one had believed her. The sun dipped low, flattening into the western ridge. Cold was creeping in, and the only thing wrapped around her shoulders was the thin wool blanket Ruth had secretly left by the boarding house door. She clutched it now like a lifeline. With each step beyond the edge of town, her shoes grew heavier, her breaths shorter. But she didn't stop. Not when the tavern boys hooted behind her. Not when old Mrs. Hargreaves spit into the dust and muttered, "Harlot." Not even when her legs buckled briefly near the edge of the cottonwood grove and she had to grip a tree to keep from collapsing. The road gave way to forest. Trees closed in around her like silent witnesses, tall and dark, their branches rustling as though whispering about the girl walking into the wild alone. Clara did not know where she was going. She only knew she could not stay. The town had made that clear. A girl who refused a man like Sloane railroad money, connections, charm enough to fool a courtroom, was no longer a girl with a future. Her stomach growled. The last thing she'd eaten was a crust of bread from the kitchen at the boarding house that morning, before the house mother found her bag packed and her eyes swollen. "You're lucky he didn't do worse," she'd scolded, as though bruises were a kindness. Clara walked until the forest swallowed the sky, and only a faint trail remained beneath her boots. Shadows stretched long across the snowless ground. Coyotes howled in the distance. Every sound made her flinch. She pulled the blanket tighter. Her breath clouded in the crisp air. She remembered a rumor, a name said in hushed tones by lantern light. North of town, past the mines, past the Devil's Ridge, a man who lived alone. Dangerous, they'd said. Killed a deputy once. Had a cave full of bones and a heart like frost. But danger, Clara thought, had already shown its face in town. In the courtroom, smirks. In the sheriff's silence. In Mr. Sloane's smile. So she turned north, into the trees. Banished, but not broken. Not yet. The way station sat like a weathered knot in the road, where stagecoaches paused long enough for coffee and gossip. Smoke drifted from the stovepipe chimney, and the door creaked each time the wind pressed against it. Inside, the light was dim, the air thick with pipe smoke and damp wool. Clara stepped in, hunched in her blanket, her boots caked with dried mud and leaves. The innkeeper looked up, startled, then wary, as if he'd seen her kind before trouble wrapped in silence. She said nothing, only lowered herself onto a bench near the stove. Her fingers trembled as they hovered above the heat. It had been 2 days since she'd eaten anything more than wild berries. Her lips were cracked, her feet blistered, but it was the silence that weighed the most. Not her own silence, but the kind that met her everywhere she went, the silence of people who saw her bruised face and chose to look away. A group of men played cards at a crooked table in the corner. Their voices were low, but the word savage rose above the rest like a spark from dry tinder. He tore out the deputy's eye with his bare hand. One man muttered, a young one with a twitching eyelid and crooked teeth. Didn't speak a word, just stood there in the rain while the man bled out. Said he was protecting a dog or a girl or something. Can't remember. That's just talk, another said, older, with a voice like gravel. He's not a savage, just broken. Fella lost his wife and daughter to a fire 10 years back. Since then, he's lived up in them pines like an animal. No visitors, no God, just rifles and traps. They say he don't age right. A third man chimed in, chuckling under his breath. Looks the same as he did a decade ago. Beard like a bear, eyes like a ghost. The stories swirled like smoke in Clara's ears. She did not flinch, did not look their way. But the name, the savage, in the mountains, planted itself in her mind. If he truly was as fearsome as they claimed, then perhaps no one would follow her there. No townsman, no lawman, no Sloane. She waited until the innkeeper's back was turned, then slipped outside. The sun was low, gilding the trees in the west. Her hunger gnawed, but fear had settled in her bones long ago, and now it felt no heavier than her blanket. She headed north. The road turned rough, then disappeared altogether. Cold crept under her clothes. Her breath turned silver in the late afternoon light. She passed an abandoned mining cart and a crooked signpost that pointed toward the ridge, its letters nearly worn away. As she climbed, the trees thickened and the world grew quiet. Even the birds seemed to keep their distance. By nightfall, she found a fallen log to rest against. The stars came out sharp and distant. Somewhere in the dark, an owl cried. Clara pulled the blanket tighter and whispered to herself, not a prayer exactly, but something close. Let the stories be wrong. Then after a moment, or let them be true enough to keep the world away. The trees blurred at the edges, swaying where they shouldn't have swayed. Clara's legs buckled once, then again, until she could no longer tell if she was walking or falling. The world around her faded into streaks of bark and snowmelt, a silence too thick to think through. Her hands scraped against stones as she crawled to a tree trunk and leaned there, heart pounding like a drum beneath cracked ribs. She had nothing left, not the strength to speak, nor the food to fuel another step. The blanket slid from her shoulders. She didn't reach for it. Somewhere near, water trickled over rocks. A raven called once and went quiet. Then, only wind. She closed her eyes. If this was how the forest took her, so be it. There was dignity in the stillness, more than in the stares and laughter that had chased her out of town. Her breath came shallow. Her hands trembled in her lap. And then, a sound. Not a branch snapping, not a fox's scurry, but a presence. Heavy, measured, watching. She didn't open her eyes at first, didn't dare, but she felt it, the change in the air, the tension of being seen. When she finally looked up, he was there. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood like part of the forest itself, broad-shouldered, cloaked in pelts, with eyes the color of slate under a thick brow. His beard, wild and dense, fell to his chest in waves the color of pine ash. And there, across the left side of his face, a scar ran jagged from temple to jaw, like a bolt of lightning carved by fate's own hand. She tried to sit straighter, but her body gave out. Her chin dropped, her breath hitched. Still, she didn't look away. He watched her for what felt like a long time. Then, without a word, he crouched. His movements were slow, deliberate. He lifted her as if she were made of leaves, one arm under her legs, the other at her back. The pelts on his shoulders smelled of smoke and pine and long, hard years. Clara wanted to ask who he was, why he was helping her, what he meant to do. But no words came. Her head rested against his chest, and for a brief second she heard it, his heartbeat. Slow, steady, human. He carried her along a narrow trail that wound upward through thickets and over moss-covered stones. Branches slapped gently at his coat, and still he said nothing. Not once did he glance down at her. Not once did he speak. The cabin appeared out of the trees like a secret too tired to hide. It was rough-hewn, dark, but solid. Smoke drifted from the chimney. A carved totem stood nearby, worn with age. He kicked the door open with one boot, stepped inside, and laid her on a cot covered in buffalo hide. Then he left, just like that. No words, no name. But Clara knew. She was in the house of the savage, and he had saved her. The first thing Clara noticed was the warmth. Not the kind from sun or summer, but the slow, steady kind that seeped into her bones from a fire long tended. She blinked up at a timbered ceiling, low and dark, and the faint scent of wood smoke clung to every board. A single window let in a shaft of morning light, catching on the dust that danced lazily in the air. She moved to sit up and winced, her muscles stiff, her throat dry as sand. The blanket covering her was thick and coarse, animal hide, stitched by hand. She ran her fingers over it slowly, then glanced around. The cabin was one large room, with a wood stove in the center, a simple table near the far wall, and shelves lined with jars, knives, and folded cloth. Everything had its place. Everything was worn, but clean. A bowl sat beside the bed, filled with clear water and a folded cloth. Next to it, a tin cup of something that smelled faintly like broth. Clara reached for the cup. Her hands trembled, but she drank anyway, each sip sliding down with aching relief. A sound caught her ear, a slow creak of the cabin door. She turned her head and saw him, the man from the woods. He stood just inside, snow melting off his boots, shoulders hulking beneath a bearskin coat. His eyes locked on hers, sharp and unreadable. He didn't speak. Clara's voice cracked from disuse. "Thank you." He didn't answer. Instead, he walked to the table, set down a wrapped bundle meat, likely, and turned to stoke the fire. He moved with a quiet strength, like someone who'd spent a long time alone. Each action was efficient, practiced. Clara sat up straighter. "I'm Clara," she said, as gently as she could. "Nothing." He ladled thick stew from a pot on the stove into a wooden bowl and placed it on a stool beside her bed. Then, without a glance or word, he turned and stepped back toward the door. "Please," she said, softer now, "why are you helping me?" He paused, his back to her, steam curling from the bowl. He answered with a grunt that might have been annoyance or amusement. Then he opened the door and stepped out into the snow, letting the cold rush in behind him. Clara sat there, spoon in hand, watching as the door shut with a final thud. She heard his boots crunch on the ground outside, heard the rustle of birds scattering from the trees. She brought the spoon to her mouth. The stew was thick with root vegetables and something smoked rabbit, maybe. It warmed her stomach, anchored her in place. Though he hadn't welcomed her, he hadn't turned her away either, and that, she thought, meant something. The silence in the cabin returned, but it felt less cruel now. She was safe. Not wanted, not invited, but safe. The snow was thinner that morning, a soft crust over frozen earth. Clara stepped outside with the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders, the cold biting but not cruel. Her legs were steadier now, and each breath felt less like a fight. The forest stretched in all directions, vast and unknowable, but no longer threatening. She stood for a moment just to feel the stillness until a sharp cry cut through the quiet. It was not the cry of a bird. It was smaller, raw, somewhere between a whimper and a gasp. Clara turned toward the trees, scanning the brush. Another cry. She moved slowly, boots crunching over frost, until she saw it tucked beneath a pine bough, trembling and bloody. A wolf pup, small enough to fit in her arms, its back leg twisted unnaturally beneath it. Her breath caught. She knelt beside it, careful not to startle the creature. Its golden eyes were wide with pain, chest heaving. Clara murmured softly, as if speaking to a child, "I won't hurt you, I promise." The pup bared tiny teeth, more out of fear than threat. She inched closer, then slipped the blanket from her shoulders and wrapped it gently around its body. When she lifted it, the pup didn't fight. It just whimpered once and closed its eyes. She turned and nearly stumbled. Elias stood a few feet away, silent as shadow. His arms were crossed, his eyes hard. Clara held the bundle to her chest. "He's hurt. He'll die out here." Elias said nothing. His expression didn't change. "I can help him," she insisted, her voice firm now, meeting his gaze. Please. For a long moment, he stood like stone. Then, with a sharp breath through his nose, he turned and walked toward the cabin. He didn't hold the door open, didn't look back, but he didn't stop her either. Inside, Clara set the pup on a folded blanket by the stove. She rummaged through a shelf, pulling jars she didn't recognize, until Elias finally strode over and, without a word, handed her a small tin of salve and a length of linen. She blinked up at him. "Thank you." He grunted again, but this time it sounded less like dismissal and more like agreement. Together, they worked in silence. She cleaned the wound, pressed the salve into torn flesh, and wrapped the leg as gently as she could. The pup whimpered but did not bite. Elias watched, arms folded, eyes unreadable. When she finished, Clara sat back and exhaled. The pup was asleep now, its chest rising and falling slowly. Elias crouched beside her, studying the animal. After a long pause, he spoke for the first time since she'd learned his name from a scrap of paper on the shelf. "He won't hunt again. Then I'll feed him," Clara said without hesitation. His eyes flicked to her, then back to the pup. He stood and walked away, but before reaching the door, he paused and, in a voice low and rough from disuse, added, "He'll need a name." Clara smiled. "So will I." He didn't answer. But when the door shut behind him, it did so gently. The days passed like falling leaves, quietly, without asking permission. The snow deepened in the woods, blanketing the trail that had once brought Clara to the cabin. There were no clocks, no bells to mark the hours, only the rhythm of firewood needing chopping, water needing boiling, and wounds both seen and unseen needing time to close. Clara rarely saw Elias in full light. He rose before dawn and disappeared into the woods like a shadow, returning only when dusk fell. Yet his presence lingered. Each morning she awoke to small signs that she was no longer surviving alone. A neat stack of firewood by the door, a strip of venison hanging by the stove, a folded shirt left beside the hearth, coarse but clean and warm. The wolf pup whom Clara had quietly named Ash recovered more quickly than she expected. He hobbled at first, dragging his mended leg behind him, but his eyes grew brighter with each passing day. She made him a nest near the stove, fed him broth from a carved bowl, and spoke to him as if he were a child who might one day answer. She spoke often in that little room. To Ash, to herself, sometimes to the flickering fire when the nights grew too long. Words, once a risk, had become a comfort again. Elias didn't speak, not much, but he listened. Sometimes he stood outside while she read aloud from an old journal she'd found buried in her bag. She had begun keeping her own entries in its back pages, lines of observation, sketches of trees and birds, notes on the way. Ash tilted his head when he heard wind move through pine. One morning, Clara found a small bundle outside the door. Inside were winter berries, still firm and glistening with frost. Tied around the cloth was a thin strip of leather. She stared at it for a long time, then tucked it into her journal. She didn't ask if it had come from him. She didn't need to. Trust bloomed slowly between them, like a flower buried under ice. Elias never hovered, never asked questions, but she could feel his watchful gaze from the edge of the woods, could sense when he passed by the window without stepping inside. He repaired the leg on the wobbly table one afternoon without a word. Another time, she saw a new stack of carved wood pieces near the hearth's spare handles, bowls, even a toy horse with no wheels. Clara smiled when she found it, not because she expected kindness, but because it came without expectation. In those weeks, the silence between them grew thick, not with discomfort, but understanding. Elias's grief sat in the corners of the room like old smoke, and Clara didn't chase it out. Her own pain echoed through her dreams, but in the stillness of the cabin it no longer roared. Sometimes she caught him watching Ash, with an expression that softened the hard lines of his face. Once, she woke in the night to find the blanket pulled up around her shoulders, the fire stoked high. Neither spoke of it. Nothing needed saying. The quiet, at last, had become a kind of peace. The wind howled that morning, threading its cold fingers through every gap in the cabin walls. Clara moved carefully, gathering kindling and feeding the stove with practiced hands. Ash limped to her side, now strong enough to follow her from room to room, his gaze ever watchful. Outside, Snow beat against the window panes in bursts, muting the forest in a white hush. While tidying a stack of linens near the far wall, Clara noticed a soft hollow beneath her feet, a subtle give in the boards. She knelt and pressed her hand to the floor. The wood was warped slightly at the edges, and with a gentle nudge of her fingers, one panel lifted with a groan. Beneath it lay a small, iron-bound chest, tucked tightly into the dark. Her breath caught. It wasn't the kind of box that held tools or dried meat. Its hinges were heavy, its surface scratched with age. She hesitated, then reached for it, fingers brushing the cold metal. Before she could lift it, the door creaked open behind her. She turned sharply. Elias stood in the threshold, a fresh rabbit in one hand, his eyes hard as the storm outside. His gaze fell on the open floorboard. The chest. He didn't move. Clara rose slowly, unsure whether to speak or step back. "I was just cleaning," she said, her voice low. "I didn't mean to pry." Still, Elias didn't speak. He crossed the room in slow, deliberate steps, set the rabbit on the table, and stood over the exposed chest. His breath came heavy, like the weight of the box had settled on his shoulders. Then, for the first time in days, he spoke. Her name was May. Clara blinked. "My daughter," he said. "May. She was 6. He crouched beside the chest and ran one hand across the lid, not to open it, but to remember. "My wife, Liza." She sang every evening, while May brushed the horses. We had a small farm just beyond the town's edge. Nothing special, but it was ours. Clara stayed still, afraid to disturb whatever truth was being unearthed. One night, I saw smoke, ran from the woods and found the roof burning. I ran into town, screaming for help. His voice tightened. "They didn't come, said it wasn't their fire, said I'd brought too many wild ways with me." His hand curled into a fist. When I got back, the barn was gone. The house was almost ash. I carried them both out. Too late. Silence filled the cabin like fog. The only sound was the pop of pine in the stove. I built this place with what I had left, brought the chest here, locked it up, and swore never to open it again. Clara stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry." He looked at her, then really looked. "I don't want your pity," he said, "but I don't mind your company." She nodded once, understanding the gift in that small concession. Elias rose, replaced the floorboard, and moved toward the fire. He didn't ask her to forget, and she wouldn't. In the quiet that followed, the cabin felt different, less like a shelter, more like a place where something once shattered was beginning to mend. The light through the cabin window had turned gold, softening the hard lines of winter. Clara sat at the table with ash curled near her feet, a half-burned pencil in her hand, a torn scrap of paper beneath it. She'd drawn the mountain that loomed behind the cabin, its ridge sharp as a knife and dusted with snow, then the trees, then the twisted path she'd taken through them to get here. Her strokes were careful, lines clean but unsure, as though afraid to impose too much beauty on something so raw. She didn't mean for Elias to see the first one. It was just a way to keep her hands from trembling, her thoughts from spiraling too far into the past. She left it on the table by accident, pressed between a jar of salt and a crooked candle holder, and went outside to fetch water from the stream. When she returned, it was gone. Nothing was said. Elias sat by the stove, sharpening a blade. His face gave nothing away. Clara said nothing either. The next morning, the broken chair in the corner, its back splintered since the day she arrived, had been repaired. Not just patched, but carefully restored, its joints sanded smooth, its legs steady again. A folded cloth sat on the seat. Next to it, a pouch of pencils, some snapped short with use, others still full length. Clara looked at Elias, who was slicing bark from a log by the door. He didn't lift his eyes, but the silence between them shifted, like wind changing direction. So she kept drawing. She drew the wolf pup mid-howl. She drew Elias's hands large, scarred, quiet in their strength. She sketched the hearth, the cabin window, the way snow gathered along the sill like resting wings. Each drawing she left on the table like offerings. None remained there long. She never saw him take them, but they always vanished by morning. And always, another small thing followed. A new knife for her work, a stack of fresh cloth, a tin of dried herbs, and a note, written in rough but careful script, for ink. Then, one night, as the wind moaned low through the trees, Elias returned from his evening walk later than usual. Clara was by the fire, mending a tear in her only dress. Ash slept nearby, muzzle twitching in dreams. Elias stood in the doorway for a long moment, then crossed the room without a word. He set a wooden box beside her. Its latch was rusted but intact. When she opened it, she gasped softly. Inside, wrapped in cloth, were paints oil-based, some dry and flaking, others still soft in their wells. The colors were faded but vivid: ochres, forest green, deep sky blue. Beneath them lay a brush, its bristles worn with time. She loved painting, Elias said. His voice was low, almost distant. Used to sit right there while I carved, said the trees changed color every time she looked at them. Clara's hands trembled around the brush. Your daughter? He nodded once. May. Clara met his gaze. Thank you for sharing her with me. He looked away, but not before she saw it. The flicker of something softened behind his eyes. Not grief exactly, but memory warmed by the firelight. That night, the cabin didn't feel quite so haunted. Not empty, not broken, just lived in, touched by love that had once been, and might, in time, become again. The snow had melted in patches around the edges of town, but the hearts of the men inside the saloon remained cold. The doors creaked open late that afternoon, and a hush followed the sound of polished boots against the floorboards. Mr. Silas Sloane had returned, draped in his usual arrogance and the scent of expensive cologne that didn't quite cover the rot underneath. He removed his gloves finger by finger, surveying the room as though it belonged to him. In a way, it did. A map was rolled out on the table in front of him, the edges still dusted with travel. Rails coming through the North Ridge, he said, tapping the paper. We'll need land, labor, and law to get it done clean. Sheriff Daly, leaning back in his chair with a toothpick between his teeth, raised an eyebrow. Ain't that the old trapper's territory? Sloane didn't flinch. Doesn't matter. He doesn't own it. No title, no deed, just squatting like the animal he is. That whole stretch of wilderness, it's wasted. I aim to change that. The men around the table murmured their agreement, eyes drawn to the promised line of steel and timber, their futures measured in rail ties and saloon profits. Then Sloane's tone shifted. Before any of that, there's a personal matter to settle. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small brooch blue enamel with chipped gold edges. Girl went missing. Clara Hart ran out like a madwoman after spreading lies. She took something of mine when she left. I'm here to get it back. The sheriff looked uneasy, but the coin Sloane slid across the table seemed to smooth over any lingering doubt. You're sure she's up there? With him? Sloane's smile was all teeth. I'm sure. A trapper said he saw her heading that way. And there's nowhere else she could have gone. She's with the savage. Thought she'd vanish into the trees and be forgotten, but I don't forget. He turned to the corner, where two men stood, waiting broad-shouldered, with rifles slung over their backs and eyes too calm for decent company. Take your dogs. I want her back by week's end. And if the mountain man gets in your way— He made a slicing motion with his finger across his throat. He's a ghost already. No one'll miss him. Outside, clouds gathered over the peaks. The townsfolk whispered from doorways and behind shuttered windows. They remembered the last time Sloane had demanded something, how it ended in smoke and silence and two wooden crosses on the hill. But fear made memory a quiet thing, and gold made it quieter still. By sundown, the trackers had ridden out with orders in their pockets and blood on their minds. The sheriff watched them go, jaw clenched, knuckles white. Behind him, Sloane lifted a glass and toasted to progress, to rail lines, to power. No one spoke Clara's name again that night, but every man there heard it echo beneath the wind like a promise or a curse. The bell above the general store door clanged sharply as Jedediah Pike, a lean-faced trapper with windburned cheeks and a tangled beard, burst inside, shaking snow from his shoulders. Eyes turned. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. He didn't wait for greetings. I saw her, he said, breathless. The Hart girl. She's up in the high woods. With him. The word him dropped into the silence like a stone in still water. Whispers flared at once. You mean the savage? Gasped old Mrs. Tillman from behind the candy counter. Jed nodded. pulling off his gloves. Passed by his trail near Bear Creek. Saw smoke. Got closer. She came out the door, looked right at me. Didn't look scared, just different. A cold shiver passed through the room. A woman, alone, up in the woods, with that man. It wasn't decent, wasn't natural. She must be bewitched, someone muttered. Or worse, said another. Word spread quickly, faster than smoke on a dry wind. By the time the sun passed its peak, half the town had gathered outside the courthouse steps, where Mr. Sloane now stood with arms crossed and a satisfied gleam in his eye. "You see," he said, projecting his voice like a man born to be heard. "What did I tell you?" He took her, dragged her off like an animal, and now she's trapped out there starving, frightened, unclean. "She didn't look frightened," Jed said, came a quiet voice. All eyes turned to Ruth Waverly, the town midwife. She stood near the back of the crowd, wrapped in her worn wool shawl, silver hair tied at the nape of her neck, eyes sharp behind her spectacles. "She looked well enough," Ruth continued. "No bruises, no sign she'd been mistreated. Perhaps she's safer up there than she ever was in town." Murmurs rippled. Sloane's smile stiffened. "She's confused," he said quickly. "He's tricked her. Savage men know how to twist a woman's mind. She needs to be rescued. Returned." "Returned to what?" Ruth asked, her voice still calm but edged with steel. "The lies, the bruises she carried when she left here, or to you, Mr. Sloane?" The silence that followed was heavier than before. Sloane's face darkened. "You're accusing me of something, old woman?" "I'm remembering," she said. "That's all." But her words struck like a match to dry timber. A few people shifted uncomfortably. The preacher's wife whispered something to her husband. The schoolmaster looked down at his boots. Sloane cleared his throat. "This isn't about the past. This is about law, about order. A girl's been taken, and I aim to bring her back." No one cheered, no one clapped, but no one stopped him either. Fear still held the town like a noose. That night, Ruth sat alone in her small parlor, candlelight flickering across her journal as she scribbled a note. She didn't know if Elias would ever read it, didn't know if Clara still trusted anyone down below, but she wrote it anyway and packed a small satchel, dried food, salve, a wool scarf, because she'd seen the look in Sloane's eye, and she knew the storm was coming. Ruth rose before the sun, her breath a quiet cloud in the early morning chill. She moved without fuss, as she had for decades, measured, deliberate, each motion stitched with purpose. The town still slept, shutters drawn tight against wind and conscience. She left without locking the door. There was nothing in her small home worth stealing that hadn't already been taken by time. The mule carried her supplies in silence. Ruth rode side saddle, her spine stiff despite the cold, bundled in layers of wool and the steady ache of worry. She passed the empty outpost by midday, its windows shuttered, the old porch sagging. The place where telegrams once ticked with news and hope now stood hollow. She tied the mule to the rail and stepped inside, sifting through the dust for anything left behind. A half-used oil lamp, a scrap of twine, an old sack that might still hold off the damp. She wasn't here for messages. She was here to remember. The girl had come through here, she was certain. Others had seen her quiet, bruised, eyes like someone already halfway gone. The outpost keeper had said she'd left at dawn, walking north without a coat, clutching a blanket like a promise. Now, weeks later, Ruth's instinct told her Clara was still up there, alive. And with him, by dusk, Ruth reached the edge of the forest where the pines thickened and the road forgot itself. The mule balked at the tree line, ears twitching. She didn't press him further. Some animals, like some people, knew where they didn't belong. She dismounted and knelt near a fallen log, pulling open her satchel. Inside, she placed a jar of pickled eggs, a tin of smoked fish, hard biscuits, a folded scarf, and a flask of tonic brewed from roots the mountain folk once taught her to find. On top, she set a note, folded once, then again. In clean, even script, it read, "The town can change. If you ever want help, you'll have it. R." She placed it gently atop the bundle, wrapped it in oilcloth, and nestled it against the log where the trail began to climb. Then she stood, touched the bark of the nearest tree, and whispered a name. Clara. Not loud, not desperate, just enough for the wind to carry it. and then she left. It was 3 days before Elias found the bundle. He spotted the shape beneath the snow-dusted cloth and paused, crouching low. His fingers unwrapped it carefully. One item at a time, supplies he hadn't asked for, but knew he'd use. And the note. That single slip of paper, words like an open door. He stood there a long while, note in hand, face unreadable. Then he struck a match and fed the page to the flame. It curled in his fingers, blackened and fluttered to ash. But he didn't walk away. He looked up toward the distant trail, then back toward the cabin. And for a moment, just a moment, he didn't look like a ghost. The wind changed just before dawn. Clara smelled the smoke before she saw it, a bitter sting in her nostrils that didn't belong to the stove or the hearth. It came from outside, wild, heavy, moving fast. She threw open the cabin door, and her breath caught. The treetops to the south glowed red beneath the still dark sky. Flames flickered above the ridge, weaving through pine boughs like serpents. Sparks snapped in the air, carried by the wind, and the sharp crackle of burning limbs echoed through the forest. Elias was already outside, coat half buttoned, axe in hand, eyes locked on the fire. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Clara's voice trembled. They did this. He gave a single nod. No doubt who they were. No lightning had fallen. No accident had sparked this blaze. This was intentional, purposeful, a torch sent to drive them out, or worse. Ash barked from inside the cabin, high and frantic. Clara rushed back in, grabbed her bag, wrapped the pup in the quilt he slept on, and cradled him to her chest. Elias threw open a hatch in the floor, one she hadn't known existed, and pulled out a tin box and a wrapped bundle. His movements were swift but steady. "The North Trail," he said at last, the first words spoken that morning. "It stays low, by the creek." They ran. Branches slapped Clara's face as she stumbled behind Elias, her arms wrapped tight around Ash. The smoke grew thicker with every step, stinging her eyes, filling her lungs with heat and panic. The fire chased them not with speed, but with hunger. Trees exploded behind them, flames leaping from trunk to trunk with terrifying purpose. A log cracked and fell across the path. Elias didn't hesitate. He heaved it aside with a grunt, face streaked with soot, and pulled Clara forward. Her legs ached, lungs burned, but she didn't stop. They reached the creek, just as the fire crowned the hill above, casting everything in the orange light of ruin. Elias splashed into the cold water, dragging her with him until they stood thigh-deep beneath the cover of a wide rock ledge. The fire roared above them, a living thing, angry and alive. Clara sobbed as she held Ash tighter. His body had gone limp, his breathing shallow, then too soon still. "No," she whispered, over and over, rocking gently as the smoke drifted across the water. "No, no, please." Elias said nothing. He only knelt beside her, his hand on her back, eyes on the burning sky. When the fire moved on, carried by wind and fuel, they emerged into a world scorched black. The cabin was gone. The clearing, the path, the roots of their new beginning, all reduced to ash. Clara laid Ash's body beneath the old spruce stump by the creek, wrapping him in the quilt he'd slept in and pressing one of her sketches against his side. She didn't cry loud. She had no voice left for that, and Elias, silent beside her, took off his coat and laid it over her shoulders. The world had taken again, and again they would have to keep going. But a piece of her heart had burned that day, and it would not grow back the same. The valley opened before them like a secret the earth had been too tired to keep hidden. Clara stood at the ridge's edge, the last of the soot still clinging to her sleeves, and looked down into a place untouched by fire. A ribbon of Silver Creek twisted through it, flanked by trembling aspens and jagged stone walls rising on all sides. Snow still clung to the shaded banks, but the grass beneath it was stubborn, green, alive. Elias said nothing as he led her down a narrow path carved into the rock. His steps were heavy, deliberate. They had walked for 2 days through charred forest and silence, past the wreckage of what had been their fragile peace. Clara hadn't asked where they were going. She simply followed. The canyon floor felt like stepping into another world, cooler, quieter, held together by shadows and wind. A stone ledge jutted out near the far wall, and beneath it a shallow cave opened just wide enough for shelter. Elias set down the satchel he had carried since the fire, then crouched to build a fire with what little dry kindling they'd found on the way. Clara didn't speak. She watched his hands, the practiced way he struck the flint, the steady rhythm of his breathing. As the fire caught, crackling to life, he sat back on his heels, staring into the flame. His face was drawn, gaunt from loss and exhaustion, but his eyes, those gray, storm-heavy eyes, held something else, a resolve she hadn't seen before. "This place," he said, his voice rough but steady, "used to be a hideout for deserters. During the war—" Clara looked up. She hadn't known he'd served, but now that he said it, the way he moved, the way he listened to the land, made sense. "I wasn't born up here," he continued. "I came from Georgia, joined the army young, believed in the cause. They fed us order, justice. Thought I'd be a hero." He looked away, jaw tight. "They sent us to a valley not unlike this one. Said it was a rebel camp. We surrounded it, rifles raised, bayonets fixed. When we reached it, it wasn't soldiers, just families, old men, children." He swallowed hard. "I told them to stop," I screamed. "They didn't. They called it a victory." Clara's throat tightened. She moved closer but didn't speak. The fire snapped gently between them. "They blamed it on me," Elias said. "Said I gave the order, a scapegoat, dishonorably discharged, came west to forget." "And did you?" Clara asked softly. "No." He looked at her then. "I built a life, had a wife, a daughter, and the town let them die." His hands curled into fists. "It's easier for them to call me a savage than face what they've done." Clara reached out and placed her hand over his. His fingers twitched, but didn't pull away. "You're not a savage," she said. "You're not what they say you are. I've seen who you are. I've lived beside it, and I'll stand by it, whatever comes." He searched her face, as if trying to find something hidden in her eyes, and what he found made him nod once barely. In the silence that followed, Clara leaned her head against his shoulder, and for the first time since the fire, he let her. In that quiet valley, surrounded by stone and sky, they made their stand not with weapons, but with truth, and the quiet promise that they would not be moved again. The town square had never been so quiet. Morning light filtered through high clouds, pale and thin, casting the buildings in cold hues of gray. People stood in clusters, some near the church steps, others outside the general store, hats in hand, murmuring under their breath. The bell hadn't been rung, but everyone knew why they'd come. Ruth had gone door to door, her voice calm but urgent, speaking to hearts that hadn't listened for years. Now, those hearts stood waiting. The sheriff paced near the gallows platform, sweat gleaming at his temples despite the chill. A table had been set up in front of the old courthouse doors, and behind it, Judge Talmadge, brittle with age but still sharp-eyed, sat with folded hands. A meeting, they'd called it. "A reckoning," Ruth had whispered. And then they saw them. Clara walked in first, her head high, hair pulled back, dressed simple but clean, her face held no fear. Beside her strode Elias, taller than any man there, coat buttoned, scar exposed in the clear light of day. The townsfolk shifted, some taking a step back without realizing it, but no one spoke. Ruth followed behind them, quiet and proud. And for the first time, Elias walked through the center of town not as a ghost, but as a man. Sloane emerged from the saloon with the swagger of someone too arrogant to see a storm coming. His coat flapped in the wind, and the metal glint of a revolver peeked from his holster. "There she is," he said loudly, pointing. "Clara Hart, my ward, taken against her will by a murderer. I demand she be returned now." Judge Talmadge lifted a brow. "She doesn't appear unwilling, Mr. Sloane." Sloane stepped forward, hand reaching for Clara's arm. "She doesn't know what she wants. That savage, he's twisted her mind." Before he could touch her, Elias moved. One step, one glare. Sloane froze. Clara's voice cut through the cold. "You don't own me. You never did. You were promised to me," Sloane hissed. "Your father owed me everything. My father is dead, and your debt died with him." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The judge motioned for quiet. Ruth stepped up and pulled a folded envelope from her coat. "There's something the town ought to see," she said. "Found it in a chest buried beneath the floor of Elias's cabin." Elias took the envelope and handed it to the judge. His hands didn't shake. Judge Talmadge unfolded the brittle paper and read. The air grew tighter with each word. A military report, a sworn deposition, a letter from a field commander detailing the massacre Elias had been blamed for. The truth. Elias had tried to stop it. The order had come from a civilian contractor, Silas Sloan. Murmurs broke into shouts. "Is that true?" someone called. Sloan paled, his lips forming words, but no sound came. The judge looked up slowly. "Mr. Sloan, you stand accused of perjury, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice." "I built this town," Sloan roared. "You'd be nothing without me." But no one moved to defend him. The sheriff finally stepped forward, his face pale. "Hand over the gun, Silas." Sloan hesitated, then saw the eyes around him. Hard eyes, eyes that remembered. Slowly, he removed the weapon and dropped it to the ground. Clara reached for Elias's hand. In that square, for the first time, justice didn't wear a uniform or carry a badge. It stood barefoot beside a scarred man with nothing left to prove, and a woman who had found her voice. The town on trial had finally chosen its side. The paper trembled slightly in Judge Talmadge's old hands, but his voice rang clear as he read aloud, line by line, the truth that had been buried longer than anyone dared to admit. And it is therefore the opinion of this court, based on the enclosed documentation, that Sergeant Elias Mercer bore no responsibility in the 1,866 massacre at West Pine Hollow. Witness testimony and corroborated orders point instead to the actions of civilian contractor Silas E. Sloan, who not only issued the fatal command, but ensured the blame fell elsewhere to preserve his own advancement. The square held its breath. Elias stood still as stone, eyes fixed on the judge, face unreadable. Clara beside him, hands clasped, could feel the tension rippling through the crowd. The townfolk were listening now, not to gossip, not to whispers, but to the sound of their own shame. Judge Talmadge laid the papers down. He looked at Sloan. "I vouched for you once," he said slowly. "When you came to this town, said you'd bring progress. I vouched for you when you whispered lies about this man." His voice cracked. "I was wrong." Sloan stood a few feet from the edge of the platform, pale beneath his fine coat, sweat glistening at his collar despite the winter air. "It's slander," he barked. "Fabricated. That chest could have held anything. That woman's been living with a lunatic in the woods. How do you know she didn't forge it?" "No one forged military records," the judge said flatly. "Not ones with dates, names, signatures. Not a map from the battlefield and 3 corroborating statements from soldiers who survived it. We've all been looking the wrong way for a long time." Murmurs rolled through the crowd. Faces that once watched Elias with suspicion now turned to Sloan with disbelief. "You people wouldn't have a town without me," Sloan snapped, stepping back toward the edge of the square. "I built the depot, brought the line, gave you work." "You took more than you gave," said a voice from the crowd. Sloan's eyes darted around. He edged toward his horse, tethered at the post just beyond the steps. "You think this place can survive without someone like me? Without money? Without power?" He bolted. Clara cried out as Sloan spun and ran, pushing through the stunned crowd. Elias moved to follow, but 2 others were faster. Samuel Holt, the town blacksmith, a bear of a man with soot still on his apron, stepped into Sloan's path like a wall of iron. Before Sloan could turn, Reverend Mathers came from the side, arms firm, voice calm. "Enough," the preacher said. "You've run long enough." Sloan struggled for a moment, a man unaccustomed to being denied. Then, surrounded by his own misdeeds, he went still. The sheriff took his arm quietly and led him away. In the square, the people stood in silence, not from shock, but from the weight of understanding. The truth had finally spoken, not in shouts or sermons, but in a paper read beneath the open sky, with the snow melting at their feet and the lies bleeding away like thawed frost. Elias didn't move to claim anything. He simply looked out over the faces that had once turned from him and nodded once. Not in triumph, not in bitterness, but in peace. The past had been laid bare, and for the first time, it no longer owned him. It was Ruth who said it first, her voice carrying through the quiet hush of the town meeting like something simple but heavy with meaning. "If we're ever to be better than what we were, we ought to start with the children." She looked around the church hall, her eyes resting on every man and woman present. "We've torn down enough. Time to build something that lasts." The townsfolk shifted in their seats, murmuring their agreement. For weeks now, since the trial and the unmasking of Sloane's deceit, the town had moved slowly, like someone waking from a long sleep, filled with bitter dreams. Elias still walked the streets like a man half-shadowed, but no longer met with turned shoulders or whispered slurs. Some even tipped their hats. A few, in quiet, awkward moments, offered words of apology. He didn't speak much, but he stayed. And Clara became a beacon. She wore simple dresses, her hands still calloused from work, but there was something in the way she looked at people that made them stop and feel seen. Children trailed her wherever she walked, curious about the woman who once vanished into the forest and returned stronger than before. It was Mayor Porter who finally put the question to Elias directly, standing beside the foundation of the old barn that had collapsed in last winter's storm. "We'd like to offer you that land, Elias. The town's, for a schoolhouse, place where Clara can teach. We'll raise the walls together. You just say the word." Elias stared at the plot of ground, eyes narrowed. The snow had melted, and soft grass was beginning to push through the soil. Ash trees bordered the edge, their trunks still blackened by a long-ago fire but alive. "I ain't a builder of schools," Elias said. "But you are a builder," the mayor replied gently. "And maybe that's close enough." For 3 days, Elias didn't give an answer. He chopped wood, repaired his roof, fixed a neighbor's cart axle in silence. Clara didn't press him. She only waited, and when he was ready, he spoke not to her but to the land. "We'll need stone for the foundation, wood for the walls, and windows, big ones, for light." Clara smiled without saying a word. They laid the first beams together. Ruth blessed the sight. Men who once doubted Elias now worked beside him, lifting, hauling, sanding. The preacher came with his sons, hammer in hand. Even the blacksmith donated forged hinges and iron nails. By summer, the schoolhouse stood tall and plain, but proud. Clara opened the doors on a Sunday morning. Inside, a chalkboard stood against one wall, and a row of benches, each carved by Elias, lined the room. Sunlight poured through the windows, and on the back wall, Clara had drawn a mural in soft charcoal: the mountain, the forest, and a wolf standing beside a girl. Children filled the room with noise and laughter. Clara called roll. Elias stood outside beneath the porch eaves, listening. He didn't go in, not yet, but he stayed close, hand on the railing, watching her speak, watching the children learn, watching something broken be made new again. In wood and stone, they had found something like redemption, something like peace. The earth was softer than Clara expected. She knelt by the creek, fingers deep in the thawed soil, her dress damp at the knees. Around her, the valley was beginning to wake, the first green blades poking through the brown, and the air carried that gentle scent of life returning. She worked slowly, reverently, turning the earth with her hands, smoothing it flat, and pressing the roots of the seedlings into place: mint, wild thyme, and lavender, plants that would bloom quietly, without much fuss. Ash was buried here, just beneath the spruce stump near the water, wrapped in the quilt he'd slept in. A smooth stone marked the place, not carved, just chosen. Clara had picked it herself, heavy and cool, with veins of quartz that shimmered faintly in the sun. She didn't cry anymore, not when she came here. The pain was still sharp, but it had changed shape, quieter now, folded into something tender. She spoke to him sometimes when she worked, just whispers. A memory, a thanks, a promise to keep going. Behind her, she heard the low scrape of wood on stone. She turned to see Elias standing beneath the pines, hauling a thick timber across his shoulder. He said nothing, but his movements were purposeful. In the clearing beside the garden, he began to build. Clara watched him fit the beams together, his hands slow but steady, each nail driven with care. By afternoon, a simple bench stood in the grass, facing the garden and the creek beyond. He didn't say who it was for. He didn't have to. She sat on it the next morning, tea in hand, as the mist curled above the water. Elias joined her, one long stride at a time, and lowered himself beside her. They sat in silence, not out of habit, but comfort, and then he smiled. It was brief, the kind of smile that came not from the mouth, but from deep in the eyes. The lines at the corners of his face softened, his shoulders relaxed. Clara glanced at him, startled by the warmth in it. He didn't look away. In town, Things were changing too, slow as thawed rivers. Children from the schoolhouse brought Clara small bouquets of wildflowers. Mothers sent loaves of bread. A carpenter donated glass panes to replace the ones cracked in the storm. Even the preacher began referring to Elias as Mr. Mercer instead of that mountain man. No one asked them to speak at gatherings or lead prayers, but when Elias passed through town to trade for supplies, men nodded to him, some clapped him on the shoulder. One old man, who'd once crossed the street to avoid him, handed over a set of hand-forged nails with a quiet, "For your roof" axe. Trust didn't come in a flood, it came in teaspoons. But it came. Clara tended the garden daily. By midsummer, the herbs bloomed in wide beds, fragrant and full, and a vine of wild roses crept up the back of the bench. Elias added an arbor without being asked. When she caught him humming once, just a single line of a melody he must have known from long ago, she didn't say anything. Some things didn't need words. Here, in the hush of the valley, beside a garden and a grave, they were no longer hiding, they were living. And the world, little by little, had begun to welcome them back. The morning sun climbed slow and golden over the rooftops of the quiet town, painting soft light across the schoolhouse windows. Inside, the air smelled of chalk and wild lavender, and the children's voices hummed like bees, restless, half-whispers and tapping feet, waiting for Clara to finish drawing a mountain on the board. A hand went up, small and bold. Eli Cormack, 7 years old, freckles stitched across his nose like constellations. "Miss Clara," he said, loud enough to hush the others, "is it true you live with a savage?" The room stilled. Even the pencils stopped scratching. Clara turned slowly, the chalk resting between her fingers. She smiled, just a little, not amused, not angry, just steady. "Who told you that word?" she asked gently. "My pa said it," Eli replied. "Said he used to be dangerous, said he don't belong in town." A few children looked down. One girl twisted the hem of her skirt. No one laughed. Clara walked to the front of the class, her voice calm as the breeze that stirred the curtains. "Well, your pa's not entirely wrong. Elias Mercer, I.S. Mercer, was dangerous. He was dangerous when he was protecting his daughter from a fire the town let burn. He was dangerous when they blamed him for something he tried to stop. And yes," she added, her eyes moving from face to face, "he's strong enough to break most men in half if he had to." The room was dead silent. She knelt down to Eli's eye level and spoke in a voice like cool water. "But he's also the man who carried me out of the snow when no one else would, who built this schoolhouse with his own hands, board by board, who carved your desks and fixed your roof when it leaked last week." Eli looked away, embarrassed now. Clara's voice softened. "So why do I live with a savage?" She stood and looked out the window where the porch of the schoolhouse faced the rising sun. "Because he saved me," she said, "and I saved him right back." Outside, Elias leaned against the porch railing, arms folded, eyes scanning the town like always, but something had changed. He no longer looked for danger. He simply watched. He saw Clara through the window and tipped his head slightly when her gaze met his. He hadn't spoken much since the garden had bloomed, and he didn't need to. His presence was enough. Folks passed him now with nods, not suspicion. Some even waved. He waved back, not always with a hand, but sometimes with the smallest lift of his chin. A child's voice floated out the open window. "I think he looks more like a bear than a savage." Laughter followed, light and unburdened. Elias chuckled just once, low and warm, and sat down on the bench he'd built. Beneath the arbor Clara had filled with roses. The petals caught the sun, red and blooming. And the town, for the first time in many years, felt whole, not perfect, not finished, but healing. A man they once feared now sat in their light. A woman they once cast out now taught their children. And a valley that had once hidden their shame now cradled something stronger, something they'd nearly forgotten how to believe in: hope.